Ladies and gentlemen, good afternoon. I'm Eric Reuter, the president of the Second Amendment Society. We are co-hosting this event with the Federalist Society, and we have a guest speaker today that we're featuring. His name is Morgan Streetman. Morgan Streetman is the founder and principal of Streetman Law over in Tampa, Florida. He's licensed to practice law in both Mississippi and the state of Florida, and he's got a wealth of experience in business transactions, particularly with a focus and emphasis on construction law. He's got a lot of experience doing construction law, so if anybody's interested in that particular field, he's definitely a good person to get to know. Please feel free to speak to him about that afterwards. He also handles a lot of negligence cases for people that are interested in handling personal injury and torts. He graduated from Duke University with his law degree, and he also has a bachelor's degree in economics that was awarded to him by the University of Florida. Mr. Streetman was recently selected by Super Lawyers as a rising star, and he's been published by several publications, including, actually, he was published twice by the Duke Law and Technology Review. He's going to be speaking to us today about the modern relevance of the Second Amendment, but he's also going to be looking at the Second Amendment in a historical context, trying to filter out some of the anachronisms that we think of when we look at the Second Amendment, you know, because the world was very different when the Constitution of the United States of America was first signed in 1787. So he's going to be talking a lot about that. And without further ado, Mr. Streetman.
All right, thank you very much, Eric. Thank you. If anyone has any trouble hearing me at any point, please feel free to just, raise your hand and let me know if I'm not speaking loud enough. As Eric told you, I'm Morgan Streetman. I'm originally from Jackson, Mississippi, and moved to Tampa area when I was about 6 years old, with my family, obviously. So, and we've been in the Tampa, Florida area essentially since then. We took a short break and went to Indiana for a little while. And we also lived in Jacksonville for a little while. So Tampa's my home, and I love it here. And I don't know if many of you plan to stay here, but Florida's a great state. It's something that I think about and talk a lot about. We've got a lot of great things going on here in Florida. Eric asked me to talk about the modern relevance of the Second Amendment, and I think that's something that, at least when I hear it, and I'm a person who owns and uses firearms regularly, it's something that kind of strikes me as sort of thinking immediately, well, there's not as much relevance to it today as there used to be. And I think that's the feeling that a lot of people have. I don't think that's true, but I think that's the general feeling that particularly educated people who consume a lot of media, have that feeling that it's, like you said, simply an anachronism from a previous time. And I'd like to urge you to think about it in a little bit of a different way that I think is borne out from the text. So what's the modern relevance of the Second Amendment? It made me think of this old phrase that I remember from some bumper sticker years ago. It's the one that makes all the other amendments possible. And you have to think about that for a minute. But the point is, and we'll get to it some more in the presentation, the point is the Second Amendment ensures that the power stays with people, with the people, not with an entity that's separate from the people, which would then become the ruler of the people. This is the text. I don't know if any of you have it memorized. I've got it memorized myself, which leads me to a funny story. I was at the Federalist Society National Lawyers Convention, I don't know, maybe 7 or 8 years ago, and we have a Florida delegation that we have dinner together every year at the convention. I go about every other year. It's quite expensive to go up to D.C. for several days, so anyway, I was actually running a little bit late, which is not that unusual for me. And so I came to the dinner a few minutes late, and when I walked in, everyone else was already seated. And they said, well, we've already just been around the room and everyone's introduced themselves, and they've stated their favorite amendment in the Bill of Rights. So now it's your turn, Morgan. And I'm very happy that I had memorized the Second Amendment because, without missing a beat, I started rattling it off. A well-regulated militia, being necessary to the security of a free state, the right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed. And I've had that memorized for years now, and it actually comes up quite often. It's a short amendment. It's one of the best ones to pick to be your favorite. And I'd recommend that all of you memorize it. And so we're going to kind of try to break it down, looking at it historically. I'm a textualist, meaning I think that we start with the text of whatever we're looking at, be it a constitution, a statute, and we go from there. If there's ambiguity in the text, then I think we can rely on other sources to try to determine the meaning of the text. But I don't think there's any ambiguity here. One thing that I'll point out you're all probably familiar with, and I tend to shy away from these what I would call hyper-intellectual arguments about the commas, or the commas should or shouldn't be. There's a lot of commas in that sentence. It doesn't seem grammatically correct to me, just the way it's written, but my analysis of that is essentially that commas in the late 1700s were kind of like salt is for my dad today. You know, they just sprinkle it on everything. And so I think they're throwing in commas. They're not even 100% sure if the commas should be there or not. It just seemed appropriate. And I've actually looked this up. I'm not just making this up out of whole cloth. And there's actually a whole level of scholarship on the use of commas in that time period and other punctuation. And it was kind of all over the place. So it's not standardized. Importantly and strangely, they tended to put a comma between a subject and its verb, which that doesn't make any sense to me at all. But I think that's what we see when we look at it, at least at the end of it. So you've basically got two clauses. You've got the militia clause, which is the preamble of the amendment, and then you've got the rights clause. And it doesn't matter what you call them. But in the rights clause, you see it says the right of the people to keep and bear arms, comma, shall not be infringed. Well, the subject there is the right of the people to keep and bear arms, and the verb is shall not be infringed. So for some reason there's a comma between the two, and I'm told this was common at the time. So my way of reading it is I drop off the first and third commas. That's just me. I think it makes better sense that way. I've looked at all the different ways you can read it. I understand the idea of the militia being a necessary part of it, and we'll get to that. But I think this is the way it reads very clearly. So I just think they had some superfluous commas, and I don't think that they would have ever realized that we were going to put so much emphasis on the commas. And for those of you who haven't practiced law, which I guess is all of you, you know, you'll learn that you can write up a contract for a deal, and you can think that it very clearly says one thing, and the other side can think that it very clearly says that exact same thing, and you sign the deal, and then years down the road, something happens and the deal blows up at some point, and you get some new lawyer coming in, and he looks at the contract, and he says, wait a minute, that doesn't say what you say it says something different, and it's more advantageous to us for it to be different. And, I mean, I've just seen this kind of thing so many times. You'd be amazed at, you know, how difficult it is to write something that will always be interpreted exactly the way that you intend it. I think it's very difficult to do. So in their defense, that's what I think was to a degree going on with the comma issue. I want to break it down into its two clauses because I think that's the most important thing. You've got the prefatory clause, which, you know, is kind of like a whereas clause in a contract or a precatory clause in some sort of will that gives the reason for, general reason for the contract or the will or the document coming into existence or the reason that things are done. It's also similar to sort of a preamble. Just like the Constitution has a preamble, which describes its reason for being, the Second Amendment has a preamble. And I think it's probably the most fundamental point that I wanted to make today is that the preamble is something that we have to understand and we have to internalize it, okay? And it is that a well-regulated militia is necessary to the security of a free state, okay? That, to me, is the point that I want to drive home with you all today. The rights clause, which is the primary operative clause, I'd want to point out to you, and you probably already know this, if you read it, it's recognizing an existing right. I heard Marco Rubio say something or another about the Second Amendment or some other amendment and it being a constitutional right, a right granted to the people by the Constitution. That's wrong. That's totally wrong. The Constitution didn't grant the people any rights. It merely recognized the rights that were already existent in the people. And this is the mindset of the founders. This is where they come from. So if you don't agree with that, that's fine. We're all allowed to have our own opinions, but that's certainly what they were setting up and what they were thinking about. And I think it's, for us to maintain a modern relevance, we have to consider whether we still agree with their philosophy or not. And I can't tell you all how to answer that question. I feel I do, at least to a strong enough degree that I think that it's a better philosophy than the other philosophies that I see being offered. I think it's probably the greatest philosophy on human government that's ever been set out by man. It's near perfection. I like it. I want to stick with it. A lot of people don't agree with that because the implication of sometimes of what that means in terms of policy. This sort of, getting to what does it mean, it reminded me also of this quote, which I don't know if it's a real quote or not, but I did find it on Bartleby, which made me think that it must be real. And you've probably all heard of it. It's about Ben Franklin coming out of the Constitutional Convention and the lady asking him, well, Dr. Franklin, what kind of government have we got, a monarchy or a republic? And Ben Franklin says, a republic, if you can keep it. And I think that's key. I think because it's not something that will automatically persist on its own. In fact, human beings will tend to undermine the idea of a free republic because of their own self-interest. So it requires eternal vigilance on the part of the citizenry if you want to live in a free republic. If you don't, there are plenty of choices around the world for you. I would like to maintain one free republic, at least here in America, which I think is fading to a degree. But I personally want to live in a free republic. I don't want to live as a slave. I don't want to live under a monarch. And so what I'm trying to convey is that as part of that, I have to understand, okay, I have a responsibility then to provide for my own safety and security and defense. So what does government want? Government wants a monopoly on force or a monopoly over force. They want to be the only place where the only force provider that is available. And I think we see that more and more where we've got government force and interacting with the people, to me, seems to be increasing in violence. And yet the idea of violent force is driven out of all other parts of society. I don't personally understand it, but you hear about these children who take a Nerf gun to school, or maybe who draw a picture of a gun and they wind up getting expelled from school and treated as though, they've got leprosy or something. I mean, it's completely ostracized. That doesn't make any sense to me. Why we're so emphatic that guns shouldn't be involved in our society. I think they should be more involved in our society. I think that's part of what we have to do to maintain our own power over our society. So let's think back, because I think, and I'm not an intellectual on this topic in a sense of I haven't studied this for years and things. I'm kind of just an everyman, but I do pay attention to the news. I do read a lot. So this is just coming from my perspective. And when I try to understand something that happened historically, I rely on my own imagination to a degree. And I kind of try to think back, and I think that's a healthy thing that a lot of us don't do, and try to think back to what it would be like to live back in colonial times. What would be our environment? And this is an interesting one. You probably can't read it up there, but that's a picture of the city of Baltimore in 1792, I think it is, or whatever that date is, 52. But in any event, if you look at it, I can count maybe 20 or 30 residences there. I mean, if anybody's seen a picture of Baltimore or been to Baltimore recently, it's a huge city. There's a lot going on there. So you have to understand this is a different time period. I personally think if I was living in one of those houses and I had to go out into the woods there at the back of the picture there, I would want to have a firearm handy. Those are untamed woods. This is a picture of the people from Nova Scotia, and you can see this is actually a historical town up there, kind of a recreation town. You can see them carrying guns. This is another picture of a colonial town near the water. And I guess what I'm trying to give you a sense for is it's very much of a pioneering lifestyle. You become ultimately responsible for your own basic needs. You have to build your own house. See, there's a guy building a house there. You have to capture or kill your own food or pick it. And, you know, these are things that are foreign to us today, these concepts. You know, we get our food from providers. Back then, you had to get your own. So, this is a picture, this is a painting from the French and Indian War. And this kind of makes me think of something, if you're having trouble trying to understand what it'd be like to live back then, which hopefully none of you are, I had a couple of recommendations for you. One is a movie that I think is just fantastic called The Northwest Passage with Spencer Tracy. It's a classic film. If you haven't seen it, it's a great movie. And actually, it was when they were filming it, it was discussed how difficult the filming was on the actors because they were having a really hard time just pretending to live back then. So they were mucking through the swamps and stuff, doing things. Spencer Tracy was Robert Rogers from Rogers Rangers. Another book I'd recommend that everybody read, and this is I'm an extremely strong believer in this, is called The Life of Washington. I don't know if you've read it. It was published back in the early 1840s, written around that time. And so I tend to think that things that are written closer to the actual event have a better chance of being accurate than things that are written more recently by commentators. So it gets into a lot of detail about Washington's early life, goes through his entire life, and you get a sense for really how difficult the lifestyle was on the frontier, so to speak, fighting the French and Indian War. It was not anything that any of us would be conversant with. None of us would be able to just change clothes one day and pick up in that lifestyle and make it. So what's the end result of that is that folks are not scared of firearms because they deal with firearms all the time. You need firearms to survive. You need them for protection. You know, Eric and I were talking about, you know, going to the outhouse. I mean, just think about what it means to have indoor plumbing. And beyond the, you know, kind of convenience of it, it's the fact of you have to go out away from your house, maybe at night, maybe out just slightly into the woods, into some place that you've built for that purpose. And, you know, do you want to have a firearm when you do that? I do, just for protection, just so in case I run into something that I wasn't expecting, I could protect myself. Now let's look at what we have today in America. And I don't want to be too critical of America's lifestyle. This is just modern lifestyle, but I think, you know, we need to take a look at how we receive things. How do we get our food? You know, do any of us try to grow our own food? Do any of us ever hunt? Do any of us do anything like that? These would have been common activities back in colonial times, and they're things that large swaths of our population never encounter today. Okay, this is a picture from a mall food court, very civilized. And these are just some of the things that, you know, we associate with our modern conveniences that they didn't have. So I think it's important as you try to conceptualize the modern relevances, you need to remember the changes that society's undergone in the meantime. And we need to think about that. I'm not saying it's good, bad. I'm not saying it has any particular input into us one way or the other. I think it's something for everyone on their own to kind of take in, internalize, analyze, and decide on. But this is part of the reason that I think a lot of us might, and maybe I'm wrong about this, but my first gut reaction wondering, you know, what is the modern relevance of the Second Amendment? You know, is it declining? Well, I think this is part of the reason that we think it is. I just kind of threw in this picture because, you know, what's the end result of all this modern convenience, lack of violence in our day-to-day lives, lack of a struggle to survive day-to-day. The end result becomes that folks are generally scared of firearms. And I'm using folks in honor of the president there, but I also like to use folks a lot. And I thought it was just funny, this lady is kind of like recoiling from this firearm that she hasn't even shot yet. Which the other part that I thought was funny is they're shooting like, you know, 15 feet away from the back of their house. And this is going to lead into something that I would tell you all sort of when I give you my action items towards the end as to what we want to do. You know, I think safety is a big part of what we can do as ambassadors for the Second Amendment, or if that's what you want to do, be an ambassador for the Second Amendment. I don't know how many of you have ever taken people shooting. I take people shooting quite a lot. It's kind of a soft outreach that I do. I find not many lawyers have shot firearms at all. You'll find many who are interested in shooting firearms, maybe even a little bit scared of them. I've encountered a number of people that are visibly shaken. And this lady, and so I looked on the internet to try to find an example of somebody who was visibly shaken by firearms. And this is a lady, a reporter up in Portland, Oregon, and she basically said she was scared to death of firearms, and she'd be okay if she never had to touch a firearm. And so her editor decided that he was going to send her on an assignment to learn how to shoot, which she went and did. And after she shoots, I don't know if you can see the faintest little bit of a smile there. This is the photo right after she just shot it. And she goes on to say that she conquered her fear. It kind of changed her mind about shooting to a degree. She said it's not something she'd ever be interested in doing again, but there was a breakdown of that overwhelming fear that she had of guns. And she's shooting there an AR-15. And so, and it discusses that in the article. She put about 30 rounds through it, apparently. And I think discovered, that these big bad looking assault rifles, as they're called, which I think is just not a great term, but this is what people are using, that they're really not that scary. And I don't know if any of you ever shot an AR-15. The recoil is almost non-existent. So it's a very pleasant experience, I think, for a shooter. I tend to take people and try to start them out on a lower caliber. Most people at least want to shoot an AR-15. I tend to try to start people on like a 22, though, because you want them to have a good experience when they go out shooting. You don't want people to have a negative experience so they'll never try it again. And so part of our job is demystifying firearms for people again, because it's not in their lives nowadays like it used to be. So we have to, consider, do we want to help to bring it back? Why am I so focused on this militia concept? I'm not talking about necessarily like the Montana militia, although that's an aspect of it. But the militia, if you look at what the Founding Fathers said, and we'll get into that, was considered to be all of the people corporately together. And you have to think about the reasoning of this. All the people corporately together have to provide for their own defense. If they don't do it, some other entity will. That other entity will become their rulers. The Founding Fathers were terrified. Well, I say terrified. The Founding Fathers were very much against the idea of a standing army. And we're going to see that in their quotations. So, a well-regulated militia being necessary to the security of a free state. Focus on the word free there. It didn't say a well-regulated militia being necessary to the security of any state, because you can certainly have a secure state with a standing army. That's been proved throughout history. But what you can't have, at least in the Founding Fathers' opinion, and they had some experience with this, they were trying to tell us something, you can't have a free state that doesn't provide for that the people of that state don't provide for their own defense. So, in the Founding Fathers' mind, standing armies were not compatible with the free state. You couldn't have a standing army existing in a free state. Perhaps it would start out existing, but they understood the way things always work. Government's always taking more power away from the people, and they were trying to put restrictions, structural restrictions in place through these founding documents to keep as best as possible that from happening. But just like Franklin said, the responsibility lies with the people. You decide if you want to be free. Nobody can decide that for you. I just want to pull out of the Constitution the section on standing armies and just kind of reference that. And I put some other stuff in there because it touches on the Navy, it touches on the militia. President's obviously commander-in-chief of the militia. But note that you're not supposed to have any appropriations for armies exceeding 2 years, okay? And that's important. To raise and support armies, this is the powers that Congress has, to raise and support armies, but no appropriation of money to that use shall be for a longer term than 2 years. I don't know, you probably all remember the news, 4 years ago now or so, on the NDAA. If you remember that term, National Defense Authorization Act, it was big news because in late December, I think it was 2012 or 2013, there was a bunch of news about it. It was an Obama power grab because they put some provision in there that allows for the indefinite detention of U.S. citizens. And it kind of was lost on, I think, everybody what the NDAA was. And I think most people thought it was some special thing that was occurring. They probably didn't really dive into it. They probably just saw the headline, indefinite detention under the NDAA, and that's probably as much as they plugged in on it. But the NDAA happens every year or two. It happens all the time. The National Defense Authorization Act reoccurs. We're going to, I think, have another one passed here this fall. Our last one, I think, was in 2014. Occurs every 2 years, and the reason for that is what we just read in the Constitution, right? Now, you tell me, are we following the spirit of the Constitution by doing it that way or not? These are some quotes that we will try not to spend too much time on them because I know some of this stuff can be a bit, repetitive, actually, and boring. But if you enjoy this kind of stuff with the Founding Fathers, take some time and go out and read. There's a federalistpapers.org site that seems pretty reputable. You've got to be a little careful when you're looking at quotations on the internet. I make efforts myself to only cite legitimate quotations. You can't always be sure, I think, and so sometimes you just got to do your best. But I try to stick to the best, most legitimate-looking sites. And these were some that I found on that one. Old Thomas Paine, I just had to throw him in there. That's not one that I liked the beginning. I like kind of the flowery language of it. It sounds very Thomas Paine to me. But George Mason, who's the co-author of the Second Amendment, he's got a lot to say on it. I think it's important. See, he says, a well-regulated militia is composed of the body of the people. So the militia is the people, trained to arms, is the proper, natural, and safe defense of a free state. Standing armies in time of peace should be avoided as dangerous to liberty. Okay? That's the message of the Second Amendment. That's it right there. It's not about hunting. It's not about personal protection. It's about not being ruled. Another George Mason, this was to the Virginia Ratifying Convention. To disarm the people is the best and most effectual way to enslave them. Noah Webster, he wrote a dictionary a lot of us use. And this is a lengthy quote, but let's just focus in on the part. I've tried to yellow the important part there. Another source of power in government is a military force. But this, to be efficient, must be superior to any force that exists among the people, or which they can command, for otherwise this force would be annihilated on the first exercise of acts of oppression. Before a standing army can rule, the people must be disarmed, as they are in almost every kingdom in Europe. So you want to know what the Second Amendment meant to these guys? This is what it meant. They're telling you right here in their own words. George Washington. Now, I think of him as being understated. But he says it may be laid down, and this is writing to Alexander Hamilton, may be laid down as a primary position in the basis of our system that every citizen who enjoys the protections of a free government owes not only a portion of his property, but even of his personal services to the defense of it. Folks, on that word owes. I mean, this is a duty, right? The Second Amendment, my right. How about my duty to keep and bear arms? My duty as a free citizen to keep and bear arms. James Madison, Federalist Society's spiritual founder, he says, besides the advantage of being armed, which the Americans possess over all people of almost every other nation. See, they're focusing in. The Founding Fathers understood that having the people being armed is what could secure them a free state. If they're not armed, there's no security for the people to remain free. Elbridge Gerry, I love that name, Elbridge. I don't hear that anymore. Well, anymore. I wasn't around back then either, but all right. What, sir, is the use of a militia? It is to prevent the establishment of a standing army, the bane of liberty. Let's talk about Switzerland. Here's a state that has lived out these principles, I think, very effectively. Principles to provide for its own defense. Now, something they have in Switzerland that we've done away with quite some time ago is conscripted armies, so mandatory service. In Switzerland, you have to serve, if you're a male, in the armed forces and the militia at some level. And many cases, that means that you actually get to keep your militia weapons. Well, you don't get to. You're required to keep your militia weapons in your house. Now, why are you required to keep them in your house? Because Switzerland's a very small country. There's a lot of, it's landlocked. His possibility for invasion by ground forces is, reasonably strong, and they were thinking that you might have to fight from your house to wherever your rallying point was with your unit. In Switzerland, they've got 4.5 firearms for every 10 people. Okay. And what I want to focus on, and I think I've got mostly pictures of Switzerland to give you some ideas of Switzerland and their militia training. But I want to focus on what they do in Switzerland, which is they take pride in firearm ownership, and they believe that it's a cultural aspect of their freedom, of their remaining free. And they haven't been invaded for many, many years. I don't think they've ever been invaded since they've constituted the country of Switzerland as we know it today. Certainly weren't invaded during World War II. And allegedly, and I don't know for sure what the thinking was, but allegedly part of the reasoning was that they were so well armed and all of the people were trained. See, because that's important. It's one thing to have a gun. It's another thing to actually know how to use it. And pardon me if anyone's offended if I say guns versus firearms. I try not to say clips, but sometimes I do. I usually say magazines, things like that. So pardon me if guns offends anybody. So these are Swiss people, and it's a corporate exercise that they undergo when they participate in the militia. This is something we don't have as a society. I was in the Army Reserves, and I never served active duty, but I did serve in the Army Reserves for 8 years. That's, something, but there's large swaths of our population, perhaps many of you here, who've not had any military experience. One thing about military experience is it does familiarize you, although it doesn't overly train you unless you're very specialized, but it does familiarize you with military firearms, so the AR-15, which is the modern-day musket. They take pride in it. They have fun with it. And we have this culture here too, but I want to encourage the growth of this culture. We need to reclaim the gun culture as being something that we're not embarrassed about. It's something positive. It's tied in with our ability to remain a free people. Founding fathers, either you trust them or you don't trust them. They told us that was required. We should be doing this as family experiences. This is great. These are some old Swiss ladies at a shooting competition. Now, they're all dolled up, and they've got these old Swiss, I don't know if those are Mannlichers or what they are, but these old Swiss rifles, and they're having a ball. I can't imagine you put 3 or 4 women of that age group in America, although you could probably find some in Mississippi somewhere. But, it's just not, it's not something that we're culturally conversant with anymore. They're very comfortable with their firearms. Okay, what's the modern relevance if we're not following the plan? And pardon me if I speed up just a little bit because I want to keep us on track to finish by 1 if I can. And I've never given this speech before, so I did practice it, but I'm not exactly doing what I practiced either. So, okay, we're not following the plan. We've got a standing army, right? So what's the modern relevance? Does it have one? And there's our standing army. It's West Point. There's an Abrams tank. Okay. The modern relevance is that, we're going to get there. I got some funny ones coming. The modern relevance is that even though we do not have a country that's free of a standing army, we do have a country that is very well armed. And we can sort of maintain our own power just by virtue of what we've already got. As long as we all make sure that we know how to use these things, we maintain these things, there's plenty of firearms. We have enough muskets in America for everybody. All right. Do we need any more gun control? It's just some funny meme or whatever I pulled off the internet. The experts agree gun control works. I don't think gun control works for the purposes that we think it works for. I think we tend to think gun control cuts down on guns, cuts down on crime, things like that. I don't think that's accurate at all. I don't think it does anything of the sort. In fact, if you know, I didn't realize this, the UK is apparently, Britain's just banned carrying knives. Because they, of course, aren't allowed to carry guns, although people still have them there. But they've now banned knife carry, and I just found an article from a couple of months ago that after they banned knife carry, actually knife violence has increased. And it's weird. You look at the statistics, and that's the way it works. Gun control results in more crime. Look at Chicago. Look at Washington, D.C. these enclaves, look at what theater did the Aurora shooting guy decide to go into? The one where they banned anybody carrying concealed. There were apparently several theaters in the area. That was the only one that didn't allow concealed weapons inside the theater. Do you think he picked that on accident? I have no idea, but it is telling. Why don't we need more gun control laws? This is my news flash. Criminals don't obey the laws. All right, let's look at gun violence, because it is a serious problem, I think, in our society, but it's not our most serious problem by any stretch. So we don't want to minimize it, but we can acknowledge some part of it. There are, in 2015, so far, I guess, and this may be actually in 2014, I'm thinking. So that may be a bit typo, but there were 9,594, it is from 2014. Yeah, deaths. 10,000 deaths, and that's bad, but I mean, we had 35,000 or so deaths from car crashes. Don't even get started on the real health issues, heart attacks, 800,000 deaths, 30 times the total number of shooting incidents, which is around, I think, 38,000 total shooting incidents. That's all. That includes things like suicides, things like people pulling guns. We lose a lot more people to other things. And now let's look at government violence, because that's a big part of what the Second Amendment is supposed to be a barrier to, government violence. And let's look at how many people can be killed by governments. Hitler, now all the figures, I don't know, I wasn't there, I didn't count the people. So this is what I, based on looking at different sources on the internet, kind of concluded, say 12 million total. About 6 million in the Holocaust, about 6 million just other kinds of people, gypsies and people who had mental problems, and Slavs, other things. So 6 years, that's 2 million a year. Okay, 10,000 and holding a candle to that. Stalin, about 25 years his reign was, maybe killed as many as 50 million people, they don't know. Mao killed something like a total of 80 or 90 million, but in one little 4-year period killed 45 million. So, and I probably shouldn't put this in there, because the president doesn't belong with those folks. But the point is to say, look at who's in favor of gun control. It's always the despots. Our founding fathers, they weren't in favor of gun control. Let's talk about some good news. And I know we got to go in about 7 or 8 minutes. So let me see if I can just go through. I think there's a lot to be happy about in America. There's a lot to be positive about where we stand and where we can go from here, because we still have that gun culture. It's still here. It may not be as organized or as culturally polished as the Swiss culture, but it's here. There's about 9 firearms for every 10 people. So there's about 1 firearm per person in this country. Sales are just smashing records this summer. We have a very well-armed citizenry. That is a huge block to tyranny. We do not have the most well-organized militia, citizen militia, although I think, frankly, some of these folks are a lot more organized than we probably give them credit for. But at least we have somebody. At least we have some people out there training, trying to do something. We've got an airsoft group there at the bottom, at the Arizona Militia Praetorian Guard there in the middle. I mean, so just got a bunch of different people trained at a bunch of different levels. A lot of them have military experience. That's something to be positive about, okay? Because organization of the militia is secondary to it being armed. If it's an armed and unorganized guerrilla force, is actually better than an organized but unarmed guerrilla force. It's part of our culture. It's part of our tradition. This is something that we can rely on. Other countries don't have this. We need to return this to a place of cultural relevance, though, for all of us. And again, it's part of it's a duty. So why do you shoot? You shoot because it's your duty as a free citizen. Why do you keep firearms and bear them? It's your duty to be proficient with them, to have them, to be able to provide for your own defense. Do we have a standing army? Yes, we do. But we can still be prepared, and that in and of itself will be a check on the government becoming tyrannical. Here we go. Let's talk numbers. Less than 1 in 10, and it actually comes closer to about 0.5 in 10 colonists took up arms against the British. So it doesn't take a majority of the population. You're talking about 5% taking up arms. Okay? We have the American militia, and I don't mean this proprietary, it's not Montana, it's America, all of us, the people. We have one firearm per person, essentially. Everyone can be armed. This is something that doesn't exist anywhere else in the world, not even close. I mean, behind us is Serbia, and I think they've got like 7.5 firearms per 10, just I think because of all the Russian stuff that's poured into there. Behind them, I think, comes Switzerland, and they're 4.5, and it drops off very fast after that. So nobody has the ability to arm their citizenry like we do in America, which I think is a great thing, and it's probably going to protect us. Now, this I pull out of this because, you know, again, I'm trying to make the point. It doesn't take everybody. Not everybody has to be firearm proficient and ready to exercise their rights and responsibilities to keep and bear arms. Not everybody was fighting, you know, in the RAF. It was actually a small group of flyers, you know, but they really made a difference. And that's the point that I want to make with the colonists, the revolutionaries, RAF flyers, whatever you want to say. A small force is enough. You know, this is a quote that is not certain that it's true. It's out there. It's been repeated a lot of times, and maybe all of you have heard it. But Admiral Yamamoto allegedly during World War II said that they could never invade the United States mainland because there would be a rifle behind every blade of grass. Okay? Because this population was so well armed that they knew there would be house to house, street to street. Everybody would be fighting them. That's a great deterrent from anybody to invade us. I just pulled this up. This is something on the Celis Scouts. It's something probably nobody is familiar with. Anyway, it was a force in Rhodesia that was fighting essentially for the Rhodesian Republic, which is now Zimbabwe. And what they basically proved through their tactics is that actually a very small army of coordinated guerrilla fighters can actually defeat a much larger force. And they were using teams of 4 to 8 people in fighting, and wound up responsible for something like 70% of the total casualties in the war that was being fought there. Now, eventually they lost, and Mugabe took over. You know, and this is the problem that we have, is the dictators. So, and I want to point out that that was a highly multiracial force, and you can see that in the picture. It was not. This is not. I'm not talking about white Afrikaners, you know, coming in as a terrorist group at all. This was a force of the people of Rhodesia. So, what's the modern relevance? If not us, then who? It's our responsibility if we want to be free people. If we don't shoulder the burden of our responsibility, who's going to do it? So these are some of my action items for you. If you want to live in a free state, it's your responsibility to keep and bear arms. You probably won't be joining a militia. I'm not in a militia, and I don't think you need to be in a militia. I got my own militia. But I think, you know, it's important that we become proficient. Okay, we all need to become proficient with firearms, shooting them, cleaning them, maintaining them. We need to practice. Practice is huge. It's hard to do. You don't get a lot of opportunities. So you need to find a gun range that you can utilize. You need to find a place that you can go to. I have a place out in the woods that I go to, which is great for me because then I don't have to pay for a range, and I don't ever have to stop shooting, you know, at the range that make you stop like every 10 minutes, which drives me nuts. But expose others, okay? Speak up, you know, vocalize the fact that you're okay with firearms. Vocalize the fact that you think that that's, if this is what you feel, I mean, vocalize whatever you think. I'm not trying to tell you what to think. I'll tell you what I think. You got to vocalize that this is part of what it means to be a free republic. And if we want to maintain that, then it's our responsibility to train to keep and bear arms. It's something that you can break down barriers with people. I take people shooting. They love it, you know, once they get to do it. I have had a couple people kind of give the cold fish, you know, they shot and said, you know, that was okay, but I don't know that I'd like to do that again. And that's okay, because, you know, different strokes for different folks. You know, less than 1 in 10 colonists actually took up muskets. Not everybody has to carry and use a firearm in some sort of conflict, okay? But it's the potential that's important. It's the potential that keeps other nations from invading. It's the potential that keeps the government in some kind of check. You know, we can go back to the quotes and look at the quotes talking about, you know, checks on government power. That's what it's about. Teach others. To me, it's crucial. Safety is so important. I see a lot of unsafe shooting going on. Almost everybody that I shoot with is generally unsafe. I'm real focused on safety. It's not, to me, it's nothing hard, but I just remember always, you know, where I am, what I'm doing, and at the end of that firearm, anything it's pointed at, you know, is something I want to destroy. And if I don't want to destroy that thing, or person, then I shouldn't be pointing that firearm at them. But that's something you can do with people, and you can do it in kind of a gentle way. You know, help them to understand, help them to learn. The NRA's got some great classes. I've never actually taken them, but I understand they're fantastic in terms of teaching the fundamentals. I just learned them from being, you know, a kid growing up in Mississippi, and, you know, just firearms are just always around. So I'm more like the colonists. It'd be strange to me if you didn't have firearms than if you did. I say, and let me just touch on that, make sure I made that point clearly enough. Part of being an ambassador for the firearms is helping to maintain the safe feeling that everybody has, and that there is a safe way to maintain and use them, okay? But you want to do it gently. So, you know, you don't want to beat people over the head with it, but you want to try to educate them in a very kind and compassionate way. You don't do it the drill sergeant style way that Eric and I probably got. Okay, and then I say carry concealed. You know, Florida concealed weapons permit's the most common concealed weapons permit in the whole country. It's held by a number of people from other states. I personally carry concealed. I'm not carrying right now, to be clear. However, I do like to carry, and it's part of me fulfilling my responsibility. I don't tend to put it in my waistband. I tend to keep it in my vehicle, but, you know, I tend to try to carry my firearm and have it at the ready. I don't think I'll ever have to use it. Hopefully I won't, but it's there. It's a part of my life. It's not something I'm scared of. It's something I'm proud of. And so my encouragement to all of you is, if you are firearm owners, enthusiasts, you know, be a little bit proud of it. You know, we have a cultural heritage here, a tradition. We have a basis for what we're doing. You know, it's reasonable. It's been proved out through history time and time again that this is what prevents tyranny. You know, and so be proud. It's part of being an American. Our gun culture is part of being an American, and I think it's something that we need to hang on to. All right, thank you.